While every manufacturer in business aviation races to build bigger cabins, longer range, and increasingly expensive jets, Cessna did exactly the opposite. It took a design that many already considered outdated and bet everything on it again. It was a risky move. Just to give you a sense of scale, more than 60% of the world's business jet fleet is in the United States, a market worth billions of dollars a year. And within that niche, two giants are fighting over the same customer, the Cessna Citation on one side and the Embraer Phenom 300 on the other, the best-selling jet in the world. What nobody expected was a quiet crisis that's been brewing in U.S. business aviation at this very point, one that could put Cessna back on top of the food chain. Cessna already had decades of experience building small jets for business aviation. The company had built its reputation precisely on simple, reliable aircraft that were cheap to operate, the kind of plane a mid-sized business owner could justify financially without needing an entire aviation department just to manage the fleet. In fact, that gap was already being filled by Learjet, Hawker, and others, but those models didn't fully solve the problem. Business owners and charter operators wanted a plane fast enough to cross a good portion of the country in a single leg, simple enough to be flown by a single pilot instead of two, and cheap enough not to require a maintenance structure comparable to much larger jets. That's exactly the space where the CJ family was born. And within that family, the CJ3 wasn't the fastest model, nor the most luxurious, nor the one with the longest range. It was the balance of all of it. And sometimes, balance is exactly what the market needs most. The project's original mission was clear, and every engineering decision revolved around four pillars: low operating cost, hour after hour of flight; simple operation without systems too complex for the customer profile Cessna wanted to serve; a single pilot in the cockpit, which drastically cut crew costs; and access to smaller airports with shorter runways. That last point sounds like a technical detail buried in a manual. It isn't. In practice, it's the difference between landing directly in the city where the executive has a meeting scheduled, or landing an hour away and still needing a car, a driver, and traffic. For someone whose main competitive advantage is selling time, that difference isn't convenience, it's the entire product. And for nearly 20 years, that formula simply worked. The CJ3 became one of the best-selling business jets in the history of corporate aviation, cementing Cessna as a benchmark in the light jet segment. But yesterday's success doesn't guarantee today's relevance, and that's exactly the problem Cessna had to face. For years, business aviation split into two well-defined extremes. On one side, very light jets, small, cheap to operate, but limited in range and cabin comfort, designed more for short hops than longer business trips. On the other side, mid-sized jets, spacious, comfortable, capable of flying much farther, but with much higher operating costs and, in most cases, requiring two pilots instead of one. In between those two extremes, there was a real gap. It was a gap similar to the one Embraer would spot years later when it launched the Phenom 300, another aircraft born precisely to occupy that middle ground between very light jets and mid-sized jets, and one that would eventually become the CJ3's main direct rival in that exact market segment. The CJ3 found that sweet spot before most competitors did. Enough range to cross a good part of the United States without needing to stop, competitive speed even against bigger, pricier jets, and a cost per flight hour that made sense both for individual business owners managing their own budget and for charter operators who need margin on every takeoff. That was the sweet spot that kept the aircraft relevant for nearly 2 decades straight, surviving different economic cycles without losing market relevance. And here's the first twist in this story. The CJ3 was already selling well. It already had an established reputation. It was already a recurring choice for charter operators and corporate fleets. So why did Cessna decide to invest millions of dollars in a new generation of a plane that on paper didn't need any change at all? The answer isn't in the engineering, it's in who's sitting inside the plane. The profile of the 2026 business jet passenger isn't the same as in 2010, and that shift happened much faster than most manufacturers expected. Today, that passenger wants constant connectivity, internet that actually works at 40,000 feet without freezing or dropping during an important remote meeting. They want bigger screens, both for work and entertainment. They want a cabin experience that comes close to what they'd find on a much more expensive jet, even while flying on an aircraft designed to be simple and economical. The original CJ3 cabin, however efficient from an operational standpoint, was starting to feel dated next to newer competitors. And in an industry where perceived value weighs almost as much as technical performance on a spec sheet, that's a real problem. One that, if ignored for too long, could cost entire clients to the right competitor at the right time. And this is exactly where Cessna made its riskiest bet in recent years, because the solution didn't come from outside the cabin, in a marketing gimmick or a new paint job. It came from inside it, in engineering that most passengers don't really notice at first glance. Remember the crisis we mentioned at the start? It's directly tied to what comes next. The Gen 2 didn't bring new engines or a fuselage redesigned from scratch. The revolution is somewhere else entirely. The Garmin G3000 Prime avionics system, with automation far more advanced than the previous generation. New seats in digital systems that simplify nearly every phase of flight, from takeoff to landing.
And this is where the story connects to something much bigger than passenger comfort, something affecting the entire business aviation industry, which few outside it are tracking closely. The world is facing a growing shortage of qualified pilots. Commercial airlines are aggressively competing for talent with business aviation, offering salaries and stability that many charter operators simply can't match. The result is that finding and keeping qualified pilots has become one of the industry's biggest operational challenges. With the Gen 2's automation, pilot workload drops drastically. Tasks that once required constant manual attention are now managed by the system itself, freeing up the pilot's mental capacity for critical decisions. This isn't just a matter of comfort, it's direct operational safety and its economic viability for single-pilot operation to remain possible even amid a shortage of qualified labor. Now picture 3 real, extremely common business aviation routes in America. New York to Nashville, Dallas to Aspen, Miami to the Bahamas. None of these trips need a Challenger with its sky-high operating costs and mandatory 2-pilot crew structure. What these trips actually require in practice is efficiency, getting there fast, burning less fuel, and lower crew costs. That's exactly the space, that exact type of mission where the CJ3 Gen2 remains extremely competitive. While the entire industry chases intercontinental range and increasingly luxurious cabins aimed at a crowd flying between continents, there's a huge slice of the market, probably the largest slice in absolute number of flights, that just needs productivity within U.S. territory itself. And that brings us straight to the showdown quietly shaping the future of this entire segment. Put the two side by side, Embraer Phenom 300E versus Cessna Citation CJ3 Gen2, the two most relevant jets in the light jet segment right now. In top speed, the two are very close, with differences that barely affect the practical experience of a passenger on a typical trip. In range, the Phenom 300E has long been recognized for its impressive capability, but the Citation CJ3 Gen2 now holds a slight advantage on paper, although the difference in real-world operations is minimal. In cabin, the Phenom still offers a bit more interior space and a greater sense of roominess, but the CJ3 Gen2 has drastically narrowed that gap with its complete redesign of seats, lighting, and interior finish, closing much of the distance that once separated the two models. In operating cost, the CJ3 Gen2 continues to hold an advantage. Lower direct operating costs, simpler and more predictable maintenance, and a long-standing reputation for owner-friendly operation all contribute to lower ownership costs throughout the aircraft's lifespan. There's no absolute winner here, and that's exactly the most interesting part of this whole rivalry.
Each manufacturer made different strategic choices for the same market segment, optimizing for slightly different audiences within the same group of buyers. And the practical result is that the end customer today has two genuinely competitive options, fighting for the same budget, the same mission, and the same type of client.
And that's exactly what explains, in practice, who's buying the CJ3 Gen2 today. Mid-sized companies that need real executive mobility, but without the cost of maintaining a larger, more complex fleet. Individual owners who fly reasonably often but don't need, and don't want to pay for, intercontinental range they'll never use. Charter operators who need a healthy profit margin on every flight hour, because that margin is exactly what determines whether the business is viable or not. And corporate fleets that already operate other Citation line models and want standardized training across the whole crew, reducing certification cost and complexity. The CJ3 Gen2 isn't trying to be everything to everyone, and that might be the smartest strategic decision in the aircraft's recent history. It's being extremely good for a specific audience, and that audience, once you add up all these buyer profiles, is much bigger than it first appears. While competitors chase bigger, faster, more expensive jets in a race that seems to never end, Cessna chose to bet on something completely different: efficiency, simplicity, and productivity, the same three pillars that have sustained the aircraft since the early 2000s. At first glance, it might look like too conservative a strategy in an industry obsessed with records for speed, range, and luxury, but maybe that's exactly what the market needs right now. The Citation CJ3 Gen2 isn't the fastest jet in the world. It isn't the biggest. It isn't the most luxurious. But maybe that's exactly why it remains relevant. In an industry obsessed with going farther and spending more, Cessna chose a different direction, doing better what already worked, and that decision might be much smarter than it looks. So, have you ordered yours yet?